So, there's a story that I think about a lot. It's the early 1980s. Paramount is looking to do a soft relaunch of the Star Trek franchise after the underwhelming critical and audience reception to the motion picture. The studio has marginalized Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry, and he's not really very happy about it. He's not happy with the new direction of the franchise, writing a 9-page memo to screenwriter Harve Bennett, complaining that the film departs considerably from the Star Trek format. More than that, the studio is planning to kill off beloved fan-favorite character Spock. The studio wisely decides that Roddenberry maybe isn't the best voice to listen to on this. After all, his last script for the Star Trek television show was about Kirk's crazy ex hijacking his body and proving that women couldn't be starship captains because of their emotions and stuff.
I never stopped you from going on with your space work.
Your world of starship captains doesn't admit women.
That was a script so toxic that even franchise co-lead Leonard Nimoy diplomatically described it as chauvinistic. So, embittered, Roddenberry turns to the only weapon he has, the fans. Roddenberry leaks his copy of the script to fans and begins to stoke up a fan hatred campaign to protect his vision of what Star Trek should be. This new Star Trek film is a betrayal of the franchise, Roddenberry insists. They're going to kill off Spock, Roddenberry protests. Speaking at a fan convention, Roddenberry's longtime fan proxy, Susan Sackett, warned fans that the studio was coming for their franchise. Quote, "So if you don't care for that idea," Sackett reportedly told attendees, "it's up to you to try to convince them." Fans took that call to action, placing advertisements in the Daily Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, demanding, quote, "Why is Paramount deliberately jeopardizing $28 million in revenues?" Some fans went even further. Producer Robert Sallin received death threats from fans. He received a call on his home phone warning, quote, "If you kill Spock, we'll kill you." This wasn't just a single outlying threat, but a sustained campaign. In fact, the crazies kept it up until the premiere of the film. Fans knew what they wanted, and what they wanted wasn't this version of Star Trek. However, Paramount didn't listen to those fringe lunatics, manipulated by a literally disenfranchised creator. They ignored the complaints. They hired a filmmaker who, by his own admission, was, quote, "not a Star Trek fanatic." That director was Nicholas Meyer. That film was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Far from being the film that killed the Star Trek franchise, it was the film that saved it. The franchise has returned to that well again, and again, and again, and again, and again, over the past 4 decades and change. It's a movie that would not exist if anybody listened to the death threat happy fans. Anyway, the reason why I'm thinking about that is because about a week and a half ago, Variety published a piece about how modern film studios are terrified of fans and how that's shaping the kinds of projects that they're producing. And, you know, that's not great. We should probably begin this video with an acknowledgement of #NotAllFans. Fandom can be, and often is, a beautiful thing. It's a collection of people coming together to share a common interest, bonding over their shared passion and love. It can inspire creativity and thoughtful discussion. Many fans are ordinary people who never venture online, who don't obsessively digest industry news. They're the kinds of people who go see Avatar, give it an A cinema score, then don't really think about it again for another 13 years. However, it increasingly seems like the loudest voices in fandom are the most unpleasant, as anybody who has written for, or frankly about, any major franchise will tell you. And look, the default response to this observation is to remark that they are simply, quote, "a few bad apples." But that saying originated as a metaphor that one bad apple can spoil the barrel. These voices, particularly when amplified, platformed, and shared, make it impossible to engage in good faith discussion about these larger franchises. And as a fan myself, let me tell you, that sucks. And look, it's worth acknowledging the elephant in the room here. There's a reason that the header image of that article on modern fandom and Variety is populated by women and people of color. It's a simple statement of fact that the sorts of performers who are targeted by these voices are disproportionately women and minorities. These voices will inevitably insist that they are not racist or sexist, but for people who claim to be gender and colorblind, they sure talk about gender and race a lot. In some ways, these complaints are just a microcosm of larger issues in public discourse. There are issues with how modern franchises work, and we've been extremely critical of a lot of major franchise output here on the Backdrop.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
However, these loud voices often seem to scapegoat women or minorities, falling back on buzzwords and culture war nonsense to account for problems facing the industry. In reality, the actual problems are systemic and structural. You want to understand why Star Trek feels different now than it did in the 90s? Well, you need to understand how the mechanics of television production have changed in the shift from broadcast television to streaming. You want to understand why Star Wars doesn't feel as special as it did when you first saw it? You need to understand how Lucasfilm existing as a Disney subsidiary is different from operating as a company owned by George Lucas. But these are complicated questions with nuanced answers. They require some understanding of how the industry works and a willingness to concede that these issues may not exist in some abstract vacuum. That's harder to unpack and explore, and so many of these voices rather buy into conspiracy theories about persecution than meaningfully engage with the actual mechanics of the things that they claim to love. And that wouldn't be a problem if these voices didn't hold an outside influence on the very franchises that they seem to loathe. Now, the Variety article was a little ambiguous when it came to discussing how studios are responding to those fans. The piece noted that many studios declined to comment for the story, even on background. Some executives were quoted saying that they, quote, try not to give it too much oxygen. However, the piece also argues that, quote, the best defense is to avoid provoking fandoms in the first place. The studios do this by focus group testing superfans. These fans will identify potential tripwires and, when studio executive concedes, if it's early enough and the movie isn't finished yet, the studio can make those kinds of changes. This doesn't really feel like news, it's more confirmation of something that we already knew. Anybody watching franchise media over the past couple of years has noticed the trend towards appeasing the worst sorts of fans, which typically means marginalizing new characters in favor of veteran performers, avoiding meaningful conflict within narratives, and making sure that the costumes look just like they do on the 4th Google image search result. It's a recipe for art that feels, to quote critic Whitney Seibold, like a sleepy, distracted handjob. I mean, what kind of service did you think fan service was referring to?
Car wash.
This is bad for a number of reasons. The most obvious is that any parent knows it's a bad idea to give a screaming child exactly what they want. It sets a bad precedent.
If you give a mouse a cookie,
he's gonna want a glass of milk.
It's the simple fact that giving these sorts of fans what they claim to want won't actually make them happy. It won't make them 12 again. To a certain extent, this is just a culmination of the outsized influence that fans have held over movie studios since the emergence of the internet. In the old days, these fans would have been content to write fan fiction and share it among their friends. Unfortunately, these days, they demand that studios give their fan fiction $200 million budgets and that everybody else has to sit through them. While this push began at the turn of the millennium, it feels like it's been accelerated by a number of other trends, most obviously the diminishing of the idea of authorship within the major arts. My approach to writing is never give the audience what they want, because the audience don't know what they want, explained comic book legend Alan Moore. That's why they're the audience. In recent years, that barrier between creator and audience has been eroded. Studios have become increasingly hostile to filmmakers, directors, and writers who seek to control the stories that they tell. When Toby Emmerich took control of Warner Bros. Back in 2017, reports suggest that the studio wanted to get away from, quote, auteur directors who want final cut. Launching its streaming shows, Marvel avoided hiring showrunners and instead recruited head writers. Media is now mostly referred to as content, a term that implies an industrial byproduct more than any creative endeavor. Recently, studios like Lionsgate have begun embracing large language models, plagiarism machines that can compile huge datasets and regurgitate material that approximates existing material. It's very telling that this push towards artificial intelligence feeds into the same impulses as appeasing these old fans. There's a sense that these models offer these loud voices what they think they want. Familiar and known elements mashed together without any underlying intent. There's an irony here, that these people are very likely to find themselves tormented by the very efforts to appease them, as these studios scramble to give these fans what they claim to want: empty, meaningless iconography with no deeper substance. Unfortunately, it's everybody else who suffers. The real victims here are the performers, often young people of color, who are left to fend for themselves in the face of hate campaigns, which the studios are now passively encouraging by acknowledging that they will listen. However, everybody else suffers too, drowning under a deluge of content designed to be inoffensive to the most offensive temperaments. Stories which understand that the only way not to provoke a backlash is not to say anything meaningful at all. It's a world in which many of these franchises would never exist in the first place, their most beloved entries smothered in the crib because they ran the risk of offending some fan somewhere. Forget about the wrath of Khan. Studios are now afraid of the wrath of fans. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.
You're in Mooney's territory now.